Buonasera. Prima vorrei dire, prima di cambiare lingua, quanto è un onore per me parlare in questo edificio, questa accademia così illustre, dove sono, diciamo, un luogo di tante creazioni, con tanta discussione, diciamo, casa della professione italiana degli architetti, e dunque è importantissimo per la storia dell'architettura, è veramente un onore. Poi volevo ringraziare tutti che hanno organizzato questo bellissimo convegno e soprattutto Irene e Tommaso che mi hanno coinvolto per primo, e poi volevo anche dire che purtroppo non parlerò moltissimo di Quarenghi stesso, perché io avevo l'idea, il progetto era di andare a San Pietroburgo prima di oggi e altre cose mi hanno trasportato da un'altra parte del mondo e non è stato possibile. Dunque, poi quello che vorrei fare è, diciamo, fare un po' di contesto generale in cui forse è utile confrontare Quarenghi stesso brevemente alla fine. È più una specie di pensiero che potrebbe essere sviluppato nel futuro. Ora cambio lingua perché è meglio anche per voi, probabilmente. Dunque, a little change the title, Changing Approaches to Precedent. So the precedents are from the Renaissance to from the Renaissance to the time of Quarenghi. So on we go now. Aspetta. Come si va? Ecco. Dunque, il tema di oggi è quello. Sorry, English. We're English, aren't we? From the theme of today is from emulation to replication. Now, in general, we are used to, in the Renaissance, emulation. There's relatively little copying. And when we go back to antiquity itself, which is the source, in most cases, of the emulation or the replication, we find very little copying back in antiquity. Cases like this, I'm showing here tombs in just outside Persepolis, where three practically identical structures, you can see them yourself, quite evident. This is a very rare phenomenon. You can perhaps bring to mind Greek temples which look very similar, frighteningly similar sometimes, and they can share dimensions, but not one of them is a copy of another. They are the independent results of using similar principles. So that applies to Roman architecture in general. Just for example, here there's the Corinthian order. You may look at the Temple of Mars Altar here in Rome and go to the Maison Carrée in Nîmes. One is half the size of the other, or at least it has columns exactly half the size of the other, no longer 60 foot, but 30 foot tall, and they're extremely similar. But they're not the same, and they're not copies. Once again, they are the results of using a known procedure, a known set of principles. Now, these principles have generally eluded later commentators, including people like Vignola, Palladio, Freyre, Perrault, and so on, who have tried to understand how the Romans designed. But in essence, without going into a lecture, I think what the ancients, both Greek and Romans, understood was that they were imitating nature, and what nature did was had a wonderful relationship between the general and the specific, between, if you like, rule and variety. So you can recognize an oak tree, and you know it's not a pine tree or a willow, from perhaps hundreds of meters. They're instantly recognizable. But yet, when you go and look at any one tree, no two are alike, and it's the same for us human beings and all animal species. And the Roman and Greek and Roman design methods aimed at producing that variety at the same time as the overall theme, if you like. So back to the question of copying. Now, in Rome, it's very rare to come across an example like this, where the Antonine column is closely modelled. It's not a copy, but it's closely modelled on Trajan's column. But the more you look at them in detail, the more you will find differences. So it's not really the case of talking of a copy. And then you can look at the Arch of Constantine, very closely modelled on the Arch of Septimius Severus, and so on. Again, you're not really talking about copying. Now, I don't think there's time to go into the Middle Ages, but just skipping over to the Renaissance, we're generally in a culture of emulation. So the important thing is to learn from antiquity, but not to regurgitate it in a slavish way or in a mechanical way, but transform it to modern, contemporary exigencies, and for each architect artist to express their own particular directions and preferences and so on. And a building like the Tempietto is particularly, how shall I say, it does a particularly fine job of bringing together multiple influences in one building. So you can recognize vaguely, in certain respects, the Pantheon, the Tholoi of both Greece and Rome, sketches of Leonardo da Vinci, even perhaps buildings like Baptistus and so on may have had some influences, and there's more. So, but the fact is that Tempietto doesn't look like any one of them, and this is probably the quintessential example of invention while respecting precedents and traditions. So it's a kind of the archetype or the quintessential example of emulation. And you know, these images hint at the tradition which follows in that mold. Now, I think now we're changing register and starting to look at the phenomenon of copying, which starts to come in even almost in that period, in a kind of way. You're not actually, here we are, I think what's interesting is that the first examples of what you might call, it's not exactly copying, but referencing, occurs with things that don't exist, okay? So they're textual, the inspiration is textual. I'm talking about here the origins of the Doric frieze, which you can read in Vitruvius, involved, hypothetically, the transformation of a wooden beam into stone and hence the triglyph. And here you see, first of all, Raphael and Penny in a painting, and then San Michele actually in a building, putting in these elements that only the conoscenti would understand. Otherwise, of course, they make a reasonable sort of decorative aesthetic effect, but conoscenti would know exactly what they are. And then there's various discussions about things that they couldn't understand. We now know what Scampilli and Pares, what they were and what they functioned. It has nothing to do with the kind of things we see at Villa Madama, but that again, we're something that doesn't exist is being brought into existence. And these projects by Antonio da Sangaro for St. Peter's are particularly significant because you can see in it definite, let's say, evocations of two, I'm thinking in particular of two, among other things, two lost monuments, the tomb of Mausolus, or the mausoleum, so is it the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus, and also the tomb of Lars Porsena, the legendary Etruscan king. So the first of these buildings existed, but in a heavily ruined state and completely inaccessible to almost anyone from Europe, and the other was a confabulation that was entirely mythical. So, but what Sangaro is trying to do is to make them recognizable, and recognition is the key for this, because if no one can recognize the citation, then the architect has been more or less wasting their time, unless it's a very private conversation, if you like. But I think Sangaro here is having, again, he's having a conversation with other like-minded, educated architects who would know the text of Pliny, which was the source for both everything one knows about, or they would have known about these monuments. So without a pointer, it's a bit difficult to get, but you can see these strange conical things there, top left, and they're not quite so evident in the model, but anyway, here you can see sketches of Sangaro that underwrite the point. On the left there, And then on the main drawing on the right, you can see the tomb of Lord Porsener, and then the other drawing in the middle on the screen, overall screen, so to speak, is the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus. So, again, taken from Pliny. And of course, the fact that there were the odd monument that existed near Rome where you could also take inspiration from. But I think Leonard Barkan's point is interesting, that the very fact of loss and ruin, the ruined state, provoked, or let's say fueled, invention in a sense, and creativity in the process of reconstruction. So reconstruction was also important in this whole sort of context. Let's pass over that. Now, eventually, you will get actually a piece or an evocation of the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus being built by Hawksmoor in London, about 1730, or at least finished 1730. You can see there's an unmistakable, if you know Pliny and you know the tradition, an unmistakable Mausoleum of Halicarnassus, but of course, probably most of the audience wouldn't know that. So, and there's other restatements of Trajan's column, and the earlier one here by Christopher Wren, you can see it isn't so directly evoking Trajan's column. It's essentially a Tuscan, very tall Tuscan column, but it's fluted. It hasn't got the spiral relief, whereas you have Fisher von Erlach, in this case having two. Around that, in the time frame of the Hawksmoor church we've just seen. So then, also relevant to this time frame is a sequence of slides I'm going to show you that involve details. Now, there's one capital in Rome which has a very particular detail, the interlocking helices of the Temple of Castor. In the center of the left-hand photograph there, underneath the abacus of the capital, you can see these very beautiful entwined helices. And it's I think there are a couple of other examples in very way-off places in Turkey, but let's say they were the only example known at this time. Now, you will see them drawn not particularly well by Palladio, and then more accurately by Desgodet. And you find them first, as far as I know, in Gibbs's Senate House in Cambridge, that's 1722, and just the next year or so, 2 or 3 years later maximum, they appear at Chiswick House in London. And here's actually one of the later examples. There were 2 phases of the building, but essentially they were created, say, just after Gibbs did his Senate House. So this is going on in this period. So it's a kind of very, the proportions aren't quite right, but it's unmistakably an attempt to reproduce the Temple of Castor capitals. And later on, there's, you can see this phenomenon carry on later. This is around 1787. And then capitals like that become very beautifully drawn by the beginning of the 19th century. And this is Cressy and Taylor, very important in the English context. And then there's the plaster cast, of course, which contributes to that in the Soane Museum. And Soane introduces these capitals in a series of projects, and he will do likewise with the Tivoli capitals. So there's a kind of way where someone like Soane is by no means copying, wouldn't at all copy a whole project, but he is definitely copying quite faithfully, or as faithfully as he can, individual elements. Now, I think we can just race over these examples, but they're in Montpellier, they're in Paris, they're in various parts of Europe. Now, what I really want to do next is stress the importance of the Greek contribution. Because up till now, we've been looking at Roman and Italianate phenomenon, and I would say that the emulation tradition is by far the dominant. You have to bear in mind that the monuments, like the Pantheon, Temple of Castor, the baths we've been, of James Cameron and so on, they are pretty well known back in Britain. You have the Grand Tour, you have a series of publications, people know these monuments, and I think it would be almost too, if you like, superficial, too cheap, too just sort of low in terms of artistry to copy such buildings back in Britain. But take yourself back to the middle of the 18th century, very few people indeed had gone to Greece. And yet there was increasingly a pressure, if you like, in treatises, in intellectual culture, privileging the Greeks and setting them up as, the sort of the acme of perfection, and Roman culture to some extent seen to be a copy of the Greek, or in some senses degraded with respect to the Greek, depending on your opinion. Of course, there's a lot of debate around that subject. But in any case, you have the Ottomans in control in Greece, you have very few people going. So what happens, of course, we've already had them mentioned today, Stuart and Rivette, and of course there's Leroy in France. They go to Greece, they measure the monuments accurately, and their publications become extremely well distributed. So you take a situation happening here around, I actually think the date of the Shugborough, sorry, that may be 1760. I might have got that wrong. But in any case, you have the monument of Lysicrates in Athens, and then at Shugborough appears a close copy, not identical, but a very close copy. And the key thing is, of course, the work of Stuart and Rivette. Now, Stuart was actually employed by Anson at Shugborough to make this little monument before the volume comes out. But of course, with time, everyone's going to, not everyone of importance is going to have that volume. So I think what Anson is encouraging here is the recognition factor. It's no good if the Greek monument is not recognized, because that wouldn't be any fun. There's no, what conversation would it be between the visiting cousin, relative, dignitary, if they don't know the Quarenghi monument of Lysicrates? But if they know it, they can turn and say, oh, jolly nice, you've got a Quarenghi monument to Lysicrates. Oh, jolly God, I'll have one too. So, you have a conversation you can promote by the fact of this recognition. And close copying is important, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to spot it. So this, in my view, triggers a new wave of copying that takes not just elements like the Temple of Castor Capitals, but whole monuments. So you'll know these examples around the world, and of course this happens for the Tower of the Winds, and then the Parthenon, and we end up eventually with the Parthenon built in Tennessee, probably in the 1930s or something, at full scale. And some of these ones are built at full scale. And then we have the, around the 1870s, the fantastically erudite and skilled work of Hansen, where you have, on the Accademia, you have the front of the Erechtheion being recreated, and you can see the ancient capitals somewhat damaged, and there's Hansen's version on the left, complete with polychromy and so on. And I haven't, this is one of the things in my current project I would like to do, is verify the actual measures, but I've got sort of hints from archaeologist friends that it actually would be the same size, or at least that front. So that's going on. I think we can sort of move on. And so I think the going back to the around 1800, going back in time then, I think it's the Greek impetus that is then fueling copies of whole Roman monuments. So you have already the two ancient ones I've already shown you, of course, joined by the bronze and Gadisized column in Place Vendôme. You get other strange things coming up in different parts of the world, and which I think this thing in Ottawa or wherever it is dates the 1930s. But it's also a very significant aspect of architectural history generally, of course, because when you get to the formation of the modern movement, let's say notionally around 1900, it's copying that is often used to denigrate historical styles. And copying is the kind of thing that we're not going to do in the modern period. So it's an extremely important, I would say, topos in architectural history that is worth investigating. Anyway, so there's, you'll know these monuments. Now, here we just get to Quarenghi, in the sense that we have the Loggia Raphael reproduced in the Hermitage, and obviously he's not the painter, but he's the architect who is created the structure, that replica. So then it's interesting to think about Quarenghi's output in the light of this sort of, say, trajectory or polarity between emulation and replication. Because in a sense, replication is an option. But then in, I think, most of his work, I will be more informed after being here tomorrow as well, this does not seem to be an important current in his work. He's very much in the freer, emulatory kind of tradition, where he's taking, just as we've heard, the ancient models are fundamental, he's learning from them, but then he's learning from everyone else down to his own day, obviously Palladio probably being the most important among them, and he's learning and taking things from them, but in the, let's say, the Tempietto emulatory tradition of producing his own inventions. So I think this is an interesting one just to leave you with, of the Anchkovich Palace. So you have here a heresy, if you like, of Doric triglyphs, more than triglyphs, actually it's sort of Doric mutuals, triglyphs, and guttae over Ionic capitals. Now this is the sort of thing that Vitruvius says you cannot do, or you shouldn't do, it's lamentable, and so on, but obviously a minority of architects were doing that in antiquity, and someone well-informed like Quarenghi would be aware of the Arche d'Aosta, where you have the Doric frieze over, in this time, Corinthian columns. So you can use your archaeological knowledge to debate Vitruvius and to inform your own inventions in the light of the huge tradition that goes, say, all the way from antiquity to his own day. But anyway, I've just hoped that this polarity is worth debating in terms of the work of this master. Thank you.
Diamo subito la parola a Cohen, perché penso che sia siamo un po' in ritardo. Grazie. Allora Paolo Cohen farà questo intervento su Ponti oltre la Manica, architetti e mercato dell'arte al tempo di Giacomo Quarenghi, nuovi documenti e nuove riflessioni, quindi ancora documenti che tirano ancora meglio fuori questo grosso personaggio. Sentiamo.